All right. My name is James Bartlett. I have been working with Power BI since, let's see here, about 2018. So, and 6 years, I guess now. And I'm a Microsoft MVP, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Awesome. My name is Ahmed. I am a Power BI consultant and trainer. I've been in the Power BI space now for about 6 years, I'd say. And I run my own consulting firm in the Power BI space. I teach at some universities as well, Power BI courses. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to being here with you all and with James to talk about our session today. I finally get it. We're going to be talking about Git integration in Fabric and how the Power BI development lifecycle looks like in the Git integration space. All right.
All right.
Shall we?
We shall.
Let's do it. Okay, so this is the loose agenda that we're going to follow today. Just kind of like to James and my style, we're going to keep things really organic and we're going to go with the flow. So our only request is that if you have any questions, just so they don't get lost in all the comments that are going to be coming throughout the stream, that you try your best just to prefix them with a Q, and then also save them towards the end, because we're already planning to leave a segment at the end of the session for Q&A. We call it the direct query. So you get to direct query with us and ask us questions. So we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes towards the end of the session for that to happen. And then we'll go through the agenda. James and I are just going to go through it organically. We've talked about this at length individually, and now we're going to just walk you all through the process. So before we get into the Power BI and Fabric space, we thought it would be important just to kind of sort of give you a background, give everyone a background on DevOps and CI and CD, because we realize that a lot of people don't come from a traditional software engineering background. They may only be, Power BI people that have sort of gone up gradually in their career. So we wanted to introduce some of these concepts that may be foreign to you, because there's a lot of terminology and jargon that gets thrown around here, and it's kind of difficult to follow along if you don't have sort of base of understanding in DevOps. So DevOps is a term. It is a methodology, if you will, a development methodology that puts at the forefront continuous integration and continuous delivery. It is a way that we can continually update and modify code, in this case Power BI reports and semantic models, and we can continuously deploy them. So it's a way to speed up the efficiency of deployment and development without compromising stability of production or live reports on the platform. So we're going to mention a couple of things here. We'll also include a couple of recommendations for other resources you can read up on this, but in a sense, that's where the term DevOps come from and how it's going to relate to Power BI.
Mm-hmm. It's also important to point out that we frequently use the term data ops when we're referring to DevOps for data or data analysis or data analytics. So you'll oftentimes hear those terms used interchangeably amongst the Power BI and Fabric community.
Definitely. Yeah, so CI and CD, you'll often hear these terms when we're talking about DevOps. So as defined earlier, CI, continuous integration. This is the continuous building and integration and testing of new code in the development environment. So the idea, again, it's sort of it's decentralizing the development process so that individuals can independently develop in their own environment, which we'll define shortly around the local repository and the idea what that is. But essentially, they develop independent, and then they propose those changes to the sort of production version of the report or the Power BI artifact in this case.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there are a couple of things that kind of come under this umbrella term of DevOps that is important to understand. So one thing is that really core to the whole DevOps approach is having a version control system. So you would have heard probably about a year and a half ago, there was a lot of buzz in the Microsoft and sort of Power BI community around finally the availability of version control or source control for Power BI. This was not necessarily a new concept that was introduced in Fabric, rather it was an existing methodology that now we have the tools to be able to carry it out inside of the Fabric/Power BI system. So the version control or source control system is sort of the Git repository. In this case, for the sake of today's demo, we're going to be talking from the perspective of Azure DevOps. Not to say that it's the only option. That's one of the routes that you can connect into Fabric, but it's the way that we're going to be demoing things today or talking through things today.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing to talk about too is, again, back to kind of some of this terminology. You hear a lot of mentions of branches and merges, and essentially as defined here, and we'll make these slides available to all of you after the stream as well. But essentially, the branch is sort of your instance of the artifact that you're working on, semantic model or report that you're modifying in your local environment. Then you are suggesting changes or proposing changes to the main branch, which is the one that's synced in with the Fabric architecture. So this idea then is that there's sort of a gate in between your development and what's out there in the wild and what's out there for users to access. So it creates that sort of safe gate between your development and the production environment.
Yep.
Anything to add?
And it's important to remember that multiple developers within a team can be working in the same workspace and potentially even on the same items within that workspace, but working on different parts of them. And having multiple development branches that are separate from each other, it's possible to bring those changes together into production without conflicting with each other. There will still potentially sometimes be merge conflicts if two people have changed the same thing, the same exact part of the same thing, independently of each other since when they created their branches. But that's fairly rare if the coordination is actually being done amongst a team where the work is actually being divided and saying, okay, you go work on these measures, I will go over here and work on these tables or this report page or that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So once again, kind of the background, what does DevOps enable? It enables working with versions as opposed to working to the production version of a report. It allows us to collaborate and code together. We're no longer dependent on someone going into a SharePoint site, checking out something, locking it from everyone else, and then making modifications. So it's a much more decentralized approach. It also, one of the key benefits as well, is it retains a history of changes, because we've all fumbled in our development at some point, made a mistake, unknowingly causing downstream issues. And so if you ever have to go back and revert to a previous version, you can all do that because it's all maintained within the repository, the Git repository. So it in a way provides a little bit more security in an environment for us to be flexible and develop without being sort of strained or restraint from the production sort of circumstances that have to be maintained.
Mm-hmm.
So really core to this all is, again, kind of what James was mentioning. This is just a visualization of what the concept he was talking about. But each of these, there's a sort of a cloud version of the Git repo that lives in Azure DevOps in our case. And then every individual developer who's part of the team will have their individual repository, a local instance of that Git repository on their individual devices. We call these local repositories. Mm-hmm. So essentially, there's a path by which, and it's clearly documented actually in the Microsoft documentation. It's fairly decent in this regard. So there's a process of cloning the Git repository and in downloading and having a file accessible to you on your local device. Then you can access the system, or you can access the code, the report, the semantic model in your local instance. And by way of branching, you can branch back into the main branch that's in the DevOps cloud environment.
Right.
So this is where you start to hear, things like commits, syncs, pulls, pushes, branches, and merges. All these things come up because those are all just different terms that we use to explain like how we ensure that our local changes are reflected in the main branch in the cloud. Mm-hmm. You were going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say it's important to note that when you initially clone a repository, what's going to happen is you're cloning the repository's main branch, and then when you have a local copy of it, you have a copy of exactly what's in the remote or the cloud version of that repository. And then what you need to do is you need to create your own development branch or working branch or feature branch. People call them lots of different things, but essentially to make your own copy of it, where when you start making your own changes, you can commit those changes and basically tell the repository, here's what I changed and why. And as you go along, you make these changes, you make these commits, and you can actually synchronize those changes with the cloud to make sure in case something happens to your laptop, all the work you've been doing up to that point is still saved, and including all of those notes about what you changed and why. And so when you're working on a development branch, a feature branch, a personal branch, whatever you want to call it, and then you make those changes, you make commits, you can push those changes to the remote. And because the remote knows that you're not working with the main branch, it will say, okay, you're working on your own separate branch over here. I'll keep track of those changes for you over here, but those changes won't automatically go into production. They won't interfere with anyone else's development branches.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of changing. Again, we're going to have some visuals on the screen to sort of explain some of these concepts too, but it's sort of creating these stop gates in between your development. So no longer are we kind of going directly into the workspace, grabbing a copy from the workspace, and then republishing it, potentially, again, causing downstream impacts. This is an environment where it's supporting the developer to develop in a way that makes sense for them without compromising the stability. It's sort of, we're going to keep coming back to these concepts again. DevOps enables speed and stability. Those are the two sort of core concepts with the DevOps sort of paradigm of development. So back to what we were talking about earlier, we'll just kind of introduce some of these with a small with a visual, because once again, we know from hearing from a lot of community members, they sort of struggle to kind of visualize the process if they're not familiar with it from their workplace. So over here you can see we're going to sort of introduce gradually more complexity to this model, but at the surface this sort of defines the basic process of development. So you kind of see how that differs from the traditional sort of way of publishing to workspaces directly. So over here on the left-hand side of the graph, you can see that we have the report developers. So here, being plural, you have multiple developers potentially accessing the same artifact simultaneously. They are going to be developing, as they do, developing their reports within the Power BI desktop environment. Except instead of saving now their file as a PBIX, as a traditional sort of Power BI report file, they're going to be saving it as a PBIP. Yeah, exactly. we gotta get new hats.
Yep. Yeah, this is the old hat. I'm showing how old I am with this hat.
Yeah, so you essentially save your file as a PBIP format. And that PBIP format is what enables this whole infrastructure around it about the Git integration and version control. Because previously, Power BI files, standard Power BI files, didn't necessarily have their code or the representation of the report in the semantic model in a text-friendly format. That text-friendly format that comes along with the PBIP file is what allows us to do code comparisons. So we can see in a programmatic way, we can see where differences are in the two versions of the report. And also we can add in a lot of automation, we can add a lot of technological sort of advancements to facilitate that process in a more automated way. Right. So the PBIP format is really the game changer here, because that's what opened the door again for the whole DevOps integration and the Git integration within the Power BI environment. Yep. Any thoughts you want to add here, James?
On the yeah, I was just going to say it was technically possible to previously to basically rip apart a PBIX file and then extract all of the source code from inside that file, and then commit all that source code into your repository, and to be able to look at the differences, changes, also sometimes called diffs, between one branch and another, or one version and another. But this all required the use of third-party tools, and you had to run them from the command line. So it was a very very technically challenging process to do, and there were ways to make it a little easier, but you kind of had to remember to do it, and so there was this it was kind of tenuous, especially working in a team environment where if you're one person, it may be able to maybe easy for you to remember to do it, always do to extract your source code and commit it, but in a team environment, it's really hard to enforce that kind of thing. Fortunately, now when the file is saved as a PBIP format from the beginning, that becomes the default. So that every time a member saves that file, whether it's the person who created it or somebody who also is opening it and modifying it later on, either way, they will always open and save in the correct format, and it will always save with the source code in folders. And then when you go to make those to commit those changes into the repository, you can actually look at the differences and say, I see. When I went and moved that visual in the report canvas from here to here, I can actually see here's the X and Y coordinates. They changed right here in the code. So, yep.
Yeah, I think it's also worth mentioning that the PBIP format technically right now is still in preview. So just to keep that in mind. However, I discovered recently when working with this, with a client that it is in public preview now, so it should be default on for you inside of Power BI. Previously, I had to notify, like, let people know that they had to go into the options and settings and enable that preview feature for
Right.
it to be able to save that.
It's
You
still
may
not
be,
the default save format. Like
yeah,
you have to when you go to save a new Power BI file, it will save as a
correct.
PBIX by default.
That's
So
correct.
you have to make the decision to save it correctly, into
Yes.
the PBIP format the first time. But after
Yeah.
that, if you always open it as a PBIP,
Yeah.
it will always save
Save
correctly.
as a
Hmm.
PBIP. Yeah,
Yep.
that's important. So yes, so the process is over here. Developer is making changes to the Power BI file that they now have saved as a Power BI project file slash pbib file. Now those changes, they're grabbing a copy of that report that exists in the repository that is pulled from their local repo. So in order to now make those changes visible in the Azure DevOps Git repo, there's a series of synchronizations that take place. The first is a commit. So if you open up Visual Studio Code, which there's a lot of documentation once again through the Microsoft documentation that talks about using specifically Azure DevOps and Visual Studio Code. So if that's the route that you're going to go, there's quite a bit of documentation there. But essentially, you're doing the first bit, which is committing your changes to the local repo. Now, the local repo exists on your local device. It's a local folder on your device. A lot of the clients I've worked with, they usually store that in a network drive that's accessible to the team members and so on. But it exists locally on your individual device. To make those changes now visible in the cloud repo, you do a push request, which essentially pushes those changes up into the cloud. So now that when you're in the DevOps environment in the browser, you'll see that there is now a new commit that was initiated to the repo. Now, we'll talk about some of the safeguards to ensure that someone's not just publishing and it immediately goes into the production or the main branch. There's some, and oftentimes most of the clients I've worked with, they already have those protections in place, but just as a FYI.
Hmm.
So now that you have everything in the Git repo, still you're not in the Fabric ecosystem yet. There's an additional step of putting in the initial Git integration with the Fabric workspace. So a workspace admin has to go in and make some initial setup to connect the repo to the workspace. And even then, it's not synchronized automatically. So when you make a change in the repo, there's a process where you have to then you'll see that there's source control. You'll see that there's differences between the workspace and the repo, and then the process of updating the contents to have the workspace reflect what's in the repo. So as you can see, there's a couple of stop gates in between here, which is creating a really good way of maintaining, again, the quality and the stability of the production instance of the report. Yes. Cool.
Indeed.
James, anything on out here?
I want to make one clarification, and I'm not sure if you misspoke, but
Please.
to the request is called a pull request. When you push, it's just called a push, and
Correct.
the difference between them is when you push, you're just taking the commits that you've made locally, and you're saying, okay, I'm going to synchronize those changes to
Yes.
the same branch on the remote or the cloud repository, just to make sure that the changes you've made locally, because it doesn't automatically happen. You could be making changes for a while, and you can even make commits, but they don't actually become part of the record in the cloud repository until you've done an explicit push.
Yeah.
And so a pull request, though, is where you're actually saying, "Hey, I think everything that I meant to do in this development branch or my feature branch is ready to go into production. I'm actually going to make a request that the repository maintainer." Maybe this is the tech lead of your team. Maybe it's maybe it's a teammate. Maybe it doesn't have to be a single person. It could just be anybody needs to do a code review with you and say, all right, I'm going to now look at the changes in this development branch and say, all right, are these ready to go into production? Yes, they are. I will pull those changes into the main branch. And so a pull
Yeah.
request is saying, hey, I, a developer, am asking the repo maintainer or a teammate, will you review my code and pull it from my dev branch into the main branch? And that's why it's called a pull request.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that correction, James. Yes, I did mean to say a push. Now, the pull request happens at the later stage, which is actually now a really
Right.
good segue into adding a little bit more flesh to that diagram. And by the way, these diagrams these are created sort of by ourselves. We've done them. Microsoft does in their documentation have a number of diagrams, but what I personally have found is they're quite daunting. Once again, if you're not really familiar with this whole ecosystem, so hopefully that will help simplify this a little bit. So you have your push that now your changes are in the DevOps environment. Now, because most organizations will set up the Azure DevOps so that a developer cannot commit directly to the main branch, it will sort of require you to create what we call a branch or a feature branch, as James referred to it earlier.
Mm-hmm.
This feature branch is essentially you create that to say, I'm not going to disrupt what's in the main branch right now, but I'm going to propose a change. I'm going to suggest a change. I made some modifications, and I'm going to represent those modifications in a branch. That branch, once it's pushed up to DevOps, you can then initiate a pull request, which is what James was talking about earlier. That pull request is going to say, I am requesting from whoever's the approver on Azure DevOps, I'm going to request that they do a review, and if they accept those changes, to merge. So a
Mm-hmm.
pull request is to initiate a request for merging that change into the main branch, which is now why
Right.
you see two instances of the Git repo. You have the working branch that you're working off of, and then you have the main branch, which is the one, again, that's synchronized up with the Fabric environment. So
Yep.
you're requesting that your proposed change gets merged into the main branch
Mm-hmm.
by way of a pull request, and you can do that
Right.
simply within the UI too of the Azure DevOps environment too. It's fairly, you see a little notification on the top of your screen that says we've picked up that there is a push request now, or a push, sorry, and now you can initiate a pull request to notify the approver of those changes.
Yep.
Awesome.
Agreed.
Cool. So now we're going to go full throttle. We're going to add the next layer of the sort of deployment process. So assuming now that you've developed locally, you're working off of your pbip version, you've published them, you've committed them to your local repo, you've pushed it to the repo in the cloud by way of a branch, the approver has reviewed those changes and now merged them into the main branch. Now you can create a deployment pipeline in the Fabric ecosystem that then will set up your traditional sort of dev, test, and production workspaces. So once again, you're creating yet another gate of separation between what's in your production. So if shit happens, it happens over here. It's not going to happen over here, and potentially derail a production ready report that lives out here in the Fabric space.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a couple of things that come up here too is people are fairly familiar. If you've been in the Power BI space, deployment pipelines have been around for some time. In fact, recently they got a UI facelift, so they look slightly different now. You still will see the old version of the UI for deployment pipelines, but you will have a different version available to you with the new UI. I imagine sometime in the future they're going to transition over, so probably be wise to get familiar with that new sort of layout. So the deployment pipelines essentially is what push your content from a dev to test to production environment. You can automate that by using PowerShell, or you can do it through the UI. And essentially, you
Mm-hmm.
can see as you transition, you can see code reviews happen within the Power BI ecosystem. So one of the questions, I guess, James, I'd like to ask your opinion on this. One of the questions I get asked is, well, if we're doing code reviews inside of Azure DevOps, why is it allowing us in the deployment pipeline also to do those code reviews or those diffs between the workspaces as we transition?
Yeah.
Maybe you share some thoughts?
Part of the reason for that is because the deployment pipelines existed, but since before there was Git integration. So part of the reason why that feature is there is because people were asking for it because the Git integration wasn't there, and they wanted to be able to look at the differences between the semantic model that was being that was currently in dev and the one that was in test, or the one that was in test between that and prod. So personally, I find fewer use cases for deployment pipelines now than I did before Git integration. I feel like now that we have the option to do a lot of that code review, a lot of the sort of separate environments between just having working locally and maybe publishing to a dedicated development workspace. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a deployment pipeline anymore. The only reason for the deployment pipelines necessarily was that you needed to make sure that it would transfer things properly from one to the next. And you needed a way to automatically change things. For instance, like your connection strings. If you're connecting your semantic model to a development database during development, and then
Yeah.
you want it to connect to the production database during production, and maybe even a test environment in between, you'd want an automated process to change those parameters between each stage of the process without having to open up the file, go in there and change it yourself, and then republish it. A lot of those things can now be done in the CI/CD pipeline right there in Azure DevOps or in GitHub or whatever you connect it to. So, like I said, I think that a lot of the use cases or the compelling cases for deployment pipelines were before we had Git integration. I think there's still some good reasons to do it. I think they require basically very little in the way of actual development or I guess like technical skill. So I think they're still a lot more friendly for something approaching a dev test prod environment for teams where nobody on that team understands Git or
Yeah.
so I think they both still have their relevant use cases. I just usually don't use them together most
Yeah.
of the time.
Yeah, I like that point. I think that, a lot of the times when you're working in the Power BI space, there's usually multiple ways to accomplish the same thing, arrive at the same destination through multiple paths. I think it really comes down to it just providing you the flexibility to see what works best for you. A lot of the engagements I've had with clients has been, they're not as familiar with the DevOps environment. And so they prefer to lean more heavily on what's natively available in the UI and Power BI/Fabric. Sometimes people that come from a background where they're like really robust into the Azure DevOps, they feel more comfortable there. They're really familiar with all the capabilities, and then they depend less on what Power BI and Fabric has to offer, right? So it kind of just depends on what your team's comfort level is. And there's actually some really good documentation. I'm not going to pull it up right now because I'll fumble over myself, but there are some really good documentations too that kind of shows the different sort of options available to you when using the Git integration in Power BI. If you go and just search up Microsoft Learn and look up lifecycle management, there's a lot of really cool documentation there that if you just want to get familiar and you kind of want to go deep on something or you want to drill down on something, you can go and do that there as well.
I see what you did there.
Yeah. So yeah, I think those were the things that I think we wanted to sort of present and talk about now. I think if James, you don't have anything to add here, I'd like for us to kind of go into the next segment, which is the screw up.
A play on words. This is the drill down. We're now going to the screw up.
Yeah, as an FYI, you're gonna hear a lot of dad jokes courtesy of me, and you're gonna hear a lot of punny jokes as well too. So just brace yourself. Yeah.
You all signed up for this.
Yeah. You signed up. You're here. Yeah. So the screw up is a segment that we have as part of these sessions where we're going to talk about certain things where things can kind of go sideways. So oftentimes, because of the flexibility that Microsoft and Fabric provides you, you can go about things in different ways, and sometimes things can kind of go wrong. And we wanted to talk a little bit about some of those mishaps or those screw ups that you should be aware of and to avoid. So I think the first one that we'd like to talk about is sort of the idea of branching. So this recently came up in a conversation where we were talking about sort of how we're going to, how long should we keep a feature branch open for? So ideally, if you're going to follow like a purist DevOps approach, the idea is that you open a feature branch and you close it within a working day. You make a change, you propose it, you close it, and you move on. And if you need to pick up again, you essentially set up a new feature branch the next day that you're working, and then you again do that. Now, the hesitation I've seen from some organizations is that they feel like there's an administrative burden that is caused on the approvers, because if we're sending a whole bunch of we're initiating a whole bunch of pull requests on feature branches, it can burden the individual who has to approve these changes and do all this. And I think that the guidance here is that, again, these systems are set up to automate and to sort of enable CI and CD, which is this continuous integration and development. If you're going to depend on human beings to do all these things, it will slow down your shop. It's going to slow down. So it's almost counterintuitive, counterproductive to what actually DevOps is attempting to do. DevOps is all about decentralization and speeding up development. So if you're going to put an individual in there who's going to review code, you are going to slow things down, right? So that's a really, important concept that you should define what sort of that timeline looks like. The other thing too, and maybe James can kind of talk a little bit about this, but it's you potentially, if you keep a branch open for too long and make multiple modifications, again, you don't have that coordination with team members. You can end up where you have merge conflicts. And dealing with that is just, if you're avoiding administrative burden and overhead, probably a good idea to avoid merge conflicts if you don't have to have them. Sometimes they're going to happen, but you don't want to make them the norm, because your approvers will hate you, and you want to keep those people on your side. Maybe you want to share your thoughts there, James? Do you have anything?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to avoid merge conflicts is to just to have a process in your team where everyone on the team knows that when they're assigned a project or a task to work on for the day, that everyone should make sure that that task isn't overlapping something that someone else is working on that day, so that when two people go to submit their pull request at the end of the day, that they will not be proposing changes to the same part of the same file. So
Yeah.
no two people shouldn't be working on the same measure at the same time. And so usually what you want to try to do is just make sure that you do a good job of this is kind of the human element of this. We spend almost all this time talking about the technical components of this, but we really do need to emphasize that it is important to get the human, the social elements of this right. And everybody needs to, everybody that works on a team together really needs to be in good communication with each other. And so when people start working on something, they should make sure that the rest of the team knows that hey, I'm working on this report, and in particular, I'm working on this page of this report, or I'm working on this semantic model. In particular, I'm working on this table or this table and the ones that are related to it, this measure in particular, this calculation group, that kind of thing. And so giving people the heads up to make sure that they're aware this is what you're working on, that can make sure that it's like, oh, okay, well, I need to make changes on it too. But you know what? There are other work items from the sprint that I could go work on first, just to make sure that I don't interfere with my teammates' work on at the same time. So short duration of a branch being open, and having the scope limited. So as soon as you create a branch, you want to basically decide ahead of time, I will only change this one file or this one component of this, and if anything that needs to be changed outside of that, it basically falls outside of scope for that development branch. And if it turns out that you just didn't realize that there was something going to be required to be changed outside of that scope, notify the rest of your team, make sure that everyone's aware that you need to change something that's out of scope for the original purpose of that development branch. And then that way you can be sure that your changes won't conflict with anyone else's changes when it's time to do the merging at the end. Another thing that you can do that can save some time, and Ahmad, you sort of touched on this a little bit, is to automate as much of the review process as possible. So part of what makes review take a long time typically is someone's going through and making sure you're following best practices, and they're looking for code smells and things like that. So what we can do with a good CI/CD pipeline is we can actually just streamline those processes right into the automated, and basically say, okay, well, we're going to have our CI/CD pipeline, we're going to have it go get the latest version of Tabular Editor, the latest version of the best practices analysis rules, and then have it run the best practice analysis on the semantic model and say, all right, does this semantic model break any rules? And if it does, have it automatically reject that before a human ever looks at it. So then the developer has a chance to go, oh, right, I forgot. I'm supposed to have format strings on all of my measures or whatever, right? They go in and make they go in and they fix that. They make a new commit. The new commit gets added to the pull request. Then the CI/CD process runs again, and it checks to say, does it pass this time? And if it passes, then it can go to another stage and say, all right, now this is actually ready for a human review. But when the human is ready to review it, they don't have nearly as much stuff to look through, because they already know that it's passed all of the tests. So they're really just looking to make sure that it doesn't do anything really weird that could potentially break something that maybe there isn't a way to test for. And there are still some cases of things that it's just we don't have a good tooling yet to test for things. One example of that, I think right now, is that we don't really have a good way to test to make sure that all of the colors match a given palette or something like that. Although I'm sure somebody's probably going to correct me and say that Michael Kowalski has written that tool or something. But so there's there's always a, I think, there's always going to need to be a good, there's always going to be a reason for sort of sanity check for a second person to get a second set of eyes and just to look at the thing and make sure that there's nothing really egregious going on. But it should be a much shorter process and a much more kind of like, not necessarily rubber stamp, but closer to rubber stamp than the go through it with a fine tooth comb
Yeah,
approach. And so it shouldn't take that much time to do a code review. And the other thing is, if you're concerned about it tying up all the time of the repo maintainer, if you have like a one person, there's nothing that says that you have to have only a single person that can do code review. You can have maybe a team of 2 or 3 people who are considered experts enough on that repository to serve as the code reviewer. Or in the case of, like, in my organization, I work for Des Moines University, and in my team, all 3 of us, we just tag whoever we think might be free to work with us. When we do a code review, we actually do a video call and we just go through it. And the person who's doing the review says, "All right, here we go, looking through this. Why'd you do this?"
yeah,
Ask them the question. "Oh yeah, I did it because of this." "All right, cool." We keep moving on, and the whole process maybe takes 10 minutes. It's not a
yeah,
big jam up of time. It's just it's a good idea to do that kind of thing, and you can spread out the work a little bit if you know that the people on your team are pretty well competent across the board to review each other's changes that way.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I think that's a valid point. And I think also too, I mean, that I think they one of the ways that the drill down sort of came to be was a conversation that James and I had a couple of months ago. We were talking about this, right? And James actually gave me a tip on John Kursky's blog. He's a fellow Microsoft MVP that has
Mm-hmm.
documented significantly and blogged a lot about data ops. So
Mm-hmm.
he bases a lot of the stuff that he's talking about off of a book or a sort of methodology that the Data Kitchen team have put out, and they have a book that you can actually go and download for free. It's called the
Yep.
Data Ops Cookbook, and it essentially walks through this data ops methodology. And so it changes the DevOps thing and adds the lens of working with data
Mm-hmm.
from people who actually work with data. So you can really appreciate the sort of the technicality there, as well as like how they also really dumb it down too. So it's an easy read. And then John Kursky's blog kind of serves as to how to implement the data ops practices in the Power BI/Fabric environment. And in fact,
Mm-hmm.
John and his team actually have a lot of freely available, publicly available test scripts that you can go and grab. So if you're testing for, breaks in a Power Query, or breaks in DAX, or you want to run an
Mm-hmm.
optimizer on your DAX measures,
Mm-hmm.
or if you're detecting for broken visuals because you made a change on the
Yep.
semantic model and you didn't necessarily know about the impacts in these thin
Right.
reports off out here. There's a lot of really cool resources there. So shout out to John's blog and go check it out. We'll make sure to include it, to link to it um, in the chat here as well for anyone who's interested. Yeah, and another thing I just wanted to kind of do, because a lot of people, they ask me about book recommendations and if you want to get more familiar with the stuff, because like what we introduced this concept at a very surface level today, just to kind of expose everyone, help demystify some of these concepts, drill down into it a little bit. There's another really cool book that I was referred to recently here. I'll put it up on screen. You might not be able to see it really well, but it's called Accelerate. If you go on Amazon and look up Accelerate book, you'll see it's a really good book that talks about sort of the proof of DevOps and the process and how it works, and how it improves sort of the speed of development. So if you're looking for a good read, I recommend some of those resources that we mentioned. I see James included John Kursky's blog here, so
Mm-hmm.
go ahead, give that a read. You're really going to love it. You'll spend a lot of time there if you get familiar with it, and there's a lot of really cool work there that you can sort of piggyback off of. Yeah. So I think, James, did you have anything you wanted to add to the screw up section? Anything else you wanted to raise awareness for?
Let's see. I think maybe one thing that, if you do end up in a situation where you've got merge conflicts, the most important thing is to not panic, and because that's the first thing a lot of people do, because merge conflicts, in comparison to most of the other things that you need to learn how to do to use Git effectively. I think merge conflicts is probably one of the more difficult things to really understand and wrap your brain around, because if you're doing Git right, you mostly don't end up running into merge conflicts, and so when you do, you're really not familiar with it you're not as accustomed to running into it, and so it's going to feel like, oh my gosh, the world is ending. So I think the most important thing is to not panic, because the nice thing about Git is that you have your version history.
Yeah.
Every time you make a commit and you push that commit into your dev branch, you have the history that thing was done. So if you have merge conflicts, you realize, okay, there have been some objects here, some items that were changed in ways where one person changed something about that thing and the other person changed that exact same thing in different ways. And so just take it slow, look at the merge conflict, and if you're using something like VS Code to do your code reviews, you can actually look at the conflicts between those things and go, okay, what's going on here? Why am I getting a merge conflict notification? And if you just take your time, slow down, and look at it, you'll realize, oh, I see. This person changed this other person changes the same thing, and you can either manually merge the two of those changes together so that both changes happen at the same time, or if it's something where both of them made approximately the same change for maybe even the same reason, but they did it in slightly different ways, you can have a quick conversation and say, so it looks like both of you were trying to solve the same problem, but you did it a little bit differently. Can we maybe run a performance test or something and figure out which one of these fixes actually is better? And then once you've done that, then you can say, okay, now I know which one to choose. And merge conflict resolution in VS Code actually gives you the ability to say, accept this one or accept that one. And if you decide that one is better than the other, you can just accept that one and move on. So it's like I said, merge conflicts are you just kind of have to take it slow and make sure that you're looking at it analytically and understand that it's, again, not the end of the world, and you can always roll back your changes, even if you choose the wrong one and that one is the one that ends up getting committed. You can roll back a commit, you can roll back a merge. All that's the whole thing with Git, is that there's nothing that's actually permanent, because you can always go back in time and grab a previous version of something and restore it to what it was previously.
Yeah,
so
definitely. I was doing this training recently for a client, and someone said in the room, if there's a merge conflict, take a deep breath, calm down, and don't go code crazy, because chances are you're going to mess things up a lot worse than what it was when you first realized there was a conflict.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's why I was saying take it slow, because if you panic, you're more likely to make mistakes. Yep.
Definitely.
So not that making a mistake would ever really permanently harm anything, because like I said, you have all the history there. You're just more likely to make things more screwed up more, where it will take more time to undo. So it's more, when I'm saying take it slow, it's not like, oh my gosh, if you make a mistake now, you're really in trouble. It's just the more mistakes you make, the harder it is to unravel them all and get back to a good state. So
yeah, absolutely.
But the more important thing to do is to just try not to end up getting in merge conflicts to begin with. And again, that comes down to really just having good communication amongst your team members and making sure everybody knows what everyone else is working on, and try not to step on each other's toes in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's key too. Like in any team, we can insert a whole bunch of different tools. We could get really sophisticated, but at the end of it, it comes to working with people, and people issues occur, and communication will be there as a sort of helper for any sort of these these problems. So communicate, keep open channels with each other, and you'll find that the development process will be more harmonious as well too. I think it's about time that we move into our last segment, which is the direct query segment. So the direct query segment is our version of the Q&A, and yes, we're trying to put as many Power BI puns as we possibly can here. So that's your opportunity to have a direct query with James and I, and ask any questions or any things you have that you'd like to surface about Git integration and what we talked about today. We'll allow, at this point, it would be probably a good idea if you have a question, like I said earlier, prefix it with the Q, a Q or question, and then we'll start looking through some of the ones that came through earlier as well. Yeah, and just we'll try to tackle as many of those as possible here. I think there was a question from Russell earlier, James.
Yeah, so I saw that one.
Yeah, do you choose PBIP or PBIR?
Can you go ahead and put his question on the screen?
I definitely can. There we go. Lovely technology. Okay, so do you choose PBIP or PBIR? They both create a file with a PBIP extension, but PBIR uses Tyndall and human readable unnested JSON. and PBIP does not really.
So there's a couple misconceptions here. First of all, PBIR is still in preview, and there's a lot of limitations on PBIR format that will make it really difficult to use it in production environments. There's just a lot of things that it's just not quite ready. I think it's out there for people to experiment and start giving feedback to Microsoft, but I would really avoid using this in any production capacity currently. If you want to play around with it, fine. But yeah, I would not use this in a Git version control environment yet. So PBIP, the file extension doesn't contain anything. The PBIP file itself is just a few lines of JSON that really tells Power BI Desktop, here's where the semantic model folder is, and here, and then the semantic model, here's where the report folder is, and then the report folder has a file in it that tells Power BI Desktop where to go to find the semantic model. So it's really just like a little chain that connects and tells Power BI Desktop where to find all the source code to open everything up. And as far as TIMDL and human readable unnested JSON, the PBIP file, if you save a Power BI a report and semantic model now with Power BI Desktop as a PBIP, it will save in TIMDL format by default. If I remember correctly, I mean, is that still a preview thing that's not turned on by default? I thought it was public by now.
Yeah,
But
I think it is a preview you have to turn on if I remember correctly. For me personally, maybe my own anecdote here is I find it a lot easier when you're looking at the BIM file, when you're looking at the semantic model, and you're trying to look at the code differences. I find it a little bit more easier than looking at the report changes right now in code. I think the PBIR format is supposed to address that, but like I said, what James's comments, earlier about the caution of using that, I would echo the same thing. I think by default, probably not turn it on right now if you're doing this. But if you want to experiment with it, maybe a good idea. But yeah, just a heads up. Right? Ditto to what James said. Okay.
All right.
Let's see. We've got another question here. I want to show it. What Git client do you prefer?
I use VS Code. And so I mean, on Windows, you have to install Git for Windows first. Then when you're using VS Code basically uses the Git command line interface app in the back end to essentially it types in all the Git commands that you would need to run if you were working on the Linux kernel or whatever. But it it does all that stuff for you, and it gives it to you in a very nice graphical user interface. And it automatically works with whatever source control repository you're using. So in a way, it's kind of like GitHub Desktop, but GitHub Desktop is designed to work with just GitHub. I mean, you can kind of force it to work with Azure DevOps if you want, but the easier way to do it is just to use VS Code, because VS Code also lets you go in and you can actually look at if you've already closed Power BI Desktop and you realize, oh, I forgot I was going to rename that measure. Guess what? You can just open up the file right there in VS Code, rename the measure right there, and you're good to go. And I like using VS Code for that reason, because it gives me the ability to edit the files and to make my changes in Git all in one interface.
Yeah, I think I'll also kind of offer another lens on that. Is I like using VS Code as well, and I find that the Microsoft documentation will show you how to do it in VS Code. So if you want to be able to have resources that you can point your team members to without having to, again, create your own wiki and do all that stuff, why not piggyback off what's already there? So Microsoft documentation already includes all the stuff in VS Code, that interface. So they've got screen grabs and stuff like that. So I find, I don't know, I'm a little bit more biased towards using something that's already documented as opposed to creating a bunch of documentation.
Yep, I agree.
Okay, we've got another question here. I'm going to throw it up on the screen. If you're using Git integration, does it still make sense to have a development UAT prod stage in the deployment pipelines? I think, James, you were talking about this earlier about, does it really make sense to use deployment pipelines today now with the Git integration? And I think the comments that, I personally, like, my comment was, if sort of where the team is with their level of comfort with Azure DevOps, if they're really comfortable working over there, why not use more of the capabilities and simply sync into Power BI after you've gone through all the steps in DevOps? But there's teams, that, maybe are less technical. They're not as familiar with DevOps. And so it makes sense maybe to use some of the UI features like deployment pipelines. That's kind of been my lens on that, my response.
There's another potential reason why you might want to have a hybrid approach where sometimes part of the review process is actually not code review. Sometimes part of it is you have stakeholders in your organization who are going to be wanting to review your changes to the report before it becomes available to the rest of the organization. These might be people who are eventually going to be consumers of the report, but they are, kind of someone who is able to sign off on something and say, yes, that looks the way that we wanted it to look before it actually becomes available to the rest of it. So you might want to do something where you've got a workspace that is the testing environment, where you've got that workspace is available for those specific testing your UAT stakeholders to look at the report as it's been published in a workspace before it gets deployed to a workspace that then turns it into something that becomes an organizational app that people are able to consume in production. So that's one instance where I think it might be a good idea to have possibly just a two-stage deployment pipeline, where you're doing all your development and everything like that. You're in Power BI Desktop, you're doing all of your branching and your merging in your Azure DevOps repository, and then when you actually put it into the main branch, have the main branch synchronized to your that testing workspace in the deployment pipeline, and then your UAT testers can go and look and make sure that everything is the way they want it before they give the final approval to deploy it to production.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I don't want to go to dive too drill too down right now in this concept. But if you're not using one of the advantages of using deployment pipelines is it maintains a binding between your semantic models and reports. So if you are doing API deployments, for example, you may have to code a little bit heavier to ensure the auto binding between them. So that's maybe a topic for another day, but I'll just put that out there in case anyone's still curious as to why Microsoft's still keeping around the deployment pipelines.
Yep. Yeah,
Okay.
that is a very good point. The deployment pipelines do basically completely hide that capability, and it's, you don't see it happening, but it is happening under the hood, where it's going and deploying those things to the next workspace, and then it's fixing the rebinding that would normally need to be done manually, and does all that for you.
Yeah.
So yep.
Right on. Okay, got a question from Ryan. We've got quite a few questions here, so hopefully we'll try to get through all of them. But if we do end up on time, we'll keep the questions and we'll maybe address them in a follow-up session. Yeah, so let's see. We've got another question here from Ryan. Ryan, nice to see you, by the way. Nice to have you here. I can see the benefits of CI and CD for a team of developers, but for a sole Power BI developer and team, what are the advantages of using CI and CD? Thoughts,
Easy.
James?
CI/CD is going to be a process that you can put things like Tabular Editor and other tools into the pipeline, and have it analyze your model and potentially even your report, make sure that you haven't missed anything. So in a team of one, where you don't have someone to review your code for you, it's even more important to have automated processes that check to make sure that you haven't messed anything up. And so having something like that to immediately tell you that the last commit that you made actually had some code smells, or basically best practice analysis violations.
Yeah.
It means that you don't actually have to always be have Tabular Editor open on your machine and running. There may be some organizations where people aren't allowed to run third-party software on their individual machines, but it might be allowed to have that run in a deployment or a pipeline like that, a CI/CD pipeline in your repository. So.
Yeah.
All kinds of reasons for an individual to be doing stuff like that. Another thing, of course, is just to be able to roll back the mistakes you might have made. Again, if you don't have anybody reviewing your changes, it's really important to be able to go back and go to a previous version of something. Also, to be able to look at your history and say, why did I make this change? I forget. Was I just being stupid? Oh, no, that's right, because somebody asked me to do it. They were being stupid.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah. So I think maybe to add one thing to that is that that book I recommended earlier, Accelerate, that we had one of our participants share in the chat. That book talks about this, answers this question of CI and CD is process heavy, and why can't we just do development the way we maybe we want with no restraints. And actually, in fact, this book kind of disproves that and says that you're actually much faster in the long term, much faster doing things with a formalized sort of CI/CD approach. So if the concern is, I don't really adopt this because it's process heavy, it's going to take more time, maybe we can kind of question that bias. Apparently, the research says otherwise.
Yep. The setup certainly takes time. So like if the concern is I've got 8 fires burning right now, I don't have enough time to go build this thing that isn't going to put out any of my fires at the moment. That is certainly a concern, and I think is a concern at many organizations. But the real question that that needs to be asked there is, do we want to just keep putting out fires manually, or do we want to install some sprinklers, some fire suppression systems?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Definitely. Definitely. Okay, next question from Lauren. Lauren, nice to see you, by the way. Do you need a dedicated integration server to add Tabular Editor to your pipeline? Great question. I'm not as familiar with this space as
no,
you
you
may
don't need
be.
a server. I mean, if you're using Azure DevOps, the whole thing is in the cloud, so you don't need a server at all. I mean, certainly, if your entire process is actually using a like if you have your repo on a server and you have, I'm sure there's probably a way to do that. I have not personally worked with repositories that are running on a local server, but I'm sure probably there are people out there who are using, what is it, like Travis or something like that as their CI/CD orchestrator. This is outside of my expertise, but if you're using a cloud uh, repo provider like Azure DevOps or GitHub, either way, they have automated pipeline stuff built into the product, and it's real easy to throw that stuff in there. There's multiple people out there that have talked about how to set that stuff up with Tabular Editor. I think again, John Kursky's blog is a great place to go look for that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. Got another question here. I expected this one. Can we get the slides, specifically those diagrams? So James, you've got something set up for us to share out.
Yep.
Do you maybe want to include the link to that GitHub repo?
We don't have a repo yet. I created a GitHub org for us. It's called TheDrillDown. So I can go get the org and if people want to watch that space for a repo to show up, I
That'd
will
be great.
get that here. So
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, right
Really
now
want-
it's going to look like totally blank and there's nothing there because we haven't finished setting it up yet. But if anybody's interested, that's the GitHub org that we have here. I'm going to hit enter. There we go. That is the GitHub org where we will be posting a repository that will contain things like show notes, like our slides and things like that. But also, if we end up talking about solutions that we recommend that maybe we've developed together, we might start putting things up there. There are also, well, I'm planning to hopefully make a place where we can collect suggestions for future topics so if people aren't able to put in their suggestions in the chat, they could go and submit those suggestions in maybe like in a discussion board, because that's another thing that GitHub supports and repos. So yeah, we're at this point, this is the inaugural one of these live streams, and we have some ideas of future topics we'd like to cover, but we're also totally open. You all in attendance here, you're the ones that we're trying to serve with this information. So hit us with your ideas, and we will start trying to build a backlog of topics we want to cover.
Of course. Great stuff. So we got a question from Alex, but didn't preface it with a Q, but I'll put it up here anyways. I will link you to James' personal PayPal, and no, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. We're not accepting donations at the moment, so we're doing this purely for the community.
Yep.
Okay.
Appreciate the sentiment, though, Alex. Thank you.
I don't know if we can squeeze in one question. We've got 3 minutes here, and I do want to mention that we've got our next session coming up on February. Let me actually just flip to the last slide here. Our next live LinkedIn session is going to be on February 5th, which is 2 weeks from today at 12 PST. Once again, same time. It'll be a Wednesday. We're going to be attempting, or at least we're going to try to keep up the momentum and keep these sessions going every other week. So stay tuned for those sessions. And with 3 minutes spare, do you have any comments on this last question, James, before we close out?
I'm not sure I understand the question. That's unfortunate, because I don't think we have enough time to try to get clarification here. But yeah, I mean, I think single line changes in any given file. I think if there's something you changed, if it takes a single line or if it takes multiple lines, however many lines it takes, if it was something you meant to do, then you probably ought to make a commit and saying why you meant to do it. And if you didn't mean to do it, you can always just undo right there in VS Code. There's a little button that allows you to undo the changes to something if you didn't mean to do it.
Also got one last question here. Let's just see, just a quick one. Is it going to be on the same topic? No, it's not going to be on the same topic. We are going to have a different topic each time we meet. So again, if you have any thoughts, anyone has any suggestions on things that they'd like to cover, that they'd like us to drill down on, please reach out. And then we'll also be circulating the next session in the coming days, so that you'll all be notified of that. I guess want to say thank you. This was a really good first stream. Thank you for spending your lunchtime with us if you're on the West Coast, or later afternoon if you're elsewhere. or some of you joining overseas, maybe middle of the night. But I think it's time for us. Um, and we hope to see you at the next drill down with Ahmed
Yep.
and James in the coming